The 1970s gave us some of the most beloved sitcoms ever made, shows that felt like family, characters we invited into our living rooms every single week. But behind a lot of that laughter, there was a different story, one that was quiet, private, and deeply painful. These are the 10 sitcom stars of the 70s who lost themselves to the bottle.
To be a big movie star.
It's only a screen test, Mrs. Carnegie. I may not even get the part.
With that face, how could they...
Number 10, David Cassidy, The Partridge Family, 1970 to 1974. If you were a teenager in the early 1970s, David Cassidy was everywhere. As Keith Partridge on The Partridge Family, he was the face of a generation. Handsome, charming, and fronting a fictional family band that somehow produced real chart-topping hits. At the peak of his fame, his fan club reportedly surpassed even those of the Beatles and Elvis combined. He was selling out arenas across the world, and his face was plastered on the bedroom walls of millions of young girls. But the version of David Cassidy the world saw on television was a far cry from what was happening behind the scenes. The show ran from 1970 to 1974, and even during that stretch, Cassidy was beginning to feel the suffocating weight of his own fame. He felt trapped, typecast, and increasingly invisible as a real person beneath the idol persona. When the show ended and the spotlight began to dim, Cassidy found himself adrift in ways he wasn't prepared for. The money, the adoration, the sense of purpose, all of it slowly faded, and alcohol began filling in the gaps. He didn't go public about his drinking for decades. In 2008, he openly admitted at a fundraiser in New York that he was an alcoholic. The years that followed were marked by DUI arrests, 3 of them in a span of 5 years, and multiple stints in rehabilitation. He filed for bankruptcy in 2015. His third marriage collapsed. He told people he had stopped drinking. He hadn't. What made the final chapter of his story especially heartbreaking was how it came to light. In 2017, after a disastrous concert where he appeared confused and stumbled on stage, Cassidy announced publicly that he was suffering from dementia, the same condition that had taken his mother and grandfather. The world responded with sympathy and concern, but the truth was something different. In a phone call with an A&E documentary producer in the final months of his life, Cassidy admitted that the dementia story wasn't the whole truth. There was no sign of dementia, he said. It was alcohol poisoning. He had never stopped drinking. He had lied to protect himself from the shame of it. In November 2017, David Cassidy was hospitalized in Fort Lauderdale with liver and kidney failure. Doctors placed him in a medically induced coma while they searched for a donor liver. He never got one. He died on November 21st, 2017, at age 67. His daughter, Katie, at his bedside, later shared that his final words were, "So much wasted time."
Oh, great interview, Keith. You just shattered my freewheeling image. What are my legions?
Number 9, Danny Bonaduce, The Partridge Family, 1970 to 1974. The red-haired, wisecracking Danny Partridge was one of the most immediately lovable characters on The Partridge Family. The kid who played him, Danny Bonaduce, started the show at just 10 years old. And unlike some of his co-stars, Bonaduce's difficult life didn't begin after the show ended. It began long before the cameras ever rolled. By his own account, Bonaduce grew up in a household marked by volatility and abuse. His father, TV writer Joseph Bonaduce, was deeply unpredictable, and Danny would later say that having the whole world love you while your own father didn't was a kind of psychological wound that never quite healed. The show gave him an escape from all of that. The attention, the applause, the belonging, it was intoxicating in its own way. and when the series ended in 1974, the loss of it hit him hard. By his late teens, Bonaduce was sleeping in his car in Hollywood. He had no money, limited prospects, and was already drinking and using drugs heavily. In 1990, he was arrested in Daytona Beach, Florida, trying to buy cocaine from an undercover police officer. The same day, he had been brought in to host a DARE anti-drug event for children. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Bonaduce himself. The years that followed were defined by cycles of sobriety and relapse that played out very publicly. He went through rehab multiple times. His 16-year marriage to Gretchen Hilmer was a war zone, shaped by his drinking, drug use, infidelity, and unpredictable behavior. In 2005, a VH1 reality series called Breaking Bonaduce captured one of the most raw and uncomfortable portraits of addiction ever put on television. Viewers watched a man genuinely struggling to hold himself together while the camera kept rolling. Bonaduce has, in the years since, found a measure of stability. He's worked in radio in Seattle, has spoken candidly about his addiction, and appears to have found a path forward. But the years between the end of the Partridge Family and his eventual sobriety were by his own description brutal. A long, chaotic fall from the innocence of that painted school bus. He once said in an interview that the cruelest thing about being a famous child is that the world freezes you at that age in their memory, while you have to keep living and changing and failing and getting older. The fans remember Danny Partridge. They don't always know what happened after the credits rolled. And for Bonaduce, what happened after was a story that took decades to find its footing.
Oh, hi. Oh, it's you.
Oh, just what a girl needs. A tender greeting from her loving brother.
Number 8. Susan Dey, The Partridge Family, 1970 to 1974. Susan Dey was 17 years old when she was cast as Laurie Partridge. She had no acting experience. She was a model, wholesome, beautiful, with a girl-next-door quality that perfectly suited the older sister role. She was an immediate fan favorite, and within a year of the show's premiere, she was one of the most recognized faces in America. But the pressure of that kind of scrutiny at that age came with a cost. During the run of The Partridge Family, Dey developed anorexia. The condition went largely unacknowledged at the time. Eating disorders weren't widely understood or discussed in the early 1970s, and the environment around her didn't help. The industry's expectations around weight and appearance were relentless, and Dey internalized them deeply. Her co-star Danny Bonaduce famously noticed at a beach party that her skin had turned orange from eating almost nothing but carrots. After the show ended in 1974, she struggled with the familiar trap of typecasting. And as the years passed, alcohol entered the picture. She eventually became a regular attendee of Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and the tabloids, in one of the more callous violations of her privacy, published that fact without her knowledge or consent. An informant inside her AA group had sold the story. Dey was furious and deeply hurt. She later addressed it publicly, saying she normally didn't talk about her alcoholism because it was her business and no one else's. She found sobriety through AA, and in her later career delivered some of the finest dramatic work of her life on the legal drama L.A. Law, for which she won a Golden Globe in 1988. Susan Dey is alive and has maintained her sobriety for many years. But the road from Laurie Partridge to that stability was far longer and harder than her cheerful on-screen image would ever have suggested. She has largely stepped away from the entertainment industry, making very few public appearances. In 2013, she was asked about the possibility of returning to television. She said she would come back only for the perfect role, and that she was content otherwise. For a woman who spent years having her private struggles exposed without her consent, A quiet life on her own terms sounds less like retreat and more like hard-won peace.
We'll leave you alone now. I know exactly how you feel. I don't know how I feel.
Number 7. Mary Tyler Moore. The Mary Tyler Moore Show, 1970 to 1977. Mary Tyler Moore was, by any measure, one of the most important women in the history of American television. Her show, which ran on CBS from 1970 to 1977, was groundbreaking in its portrayal of a single professional woman navigating life on her own terms. It won 29 Emmy Awards over its 7-season run. It is still considered one of the greatest sitcoms ever produced. Behind that legacy was a deeply complicated personal life. Moore grew up in a household shaped by her mother's alcoholism, an unpredictable, cyclical kind of drinking that alternated between dry periods and sudden collapses. Watching that as a child left Moore determined never to become her mother. As she told NPR's Terry Gross, she made a promise to herself that she would never be that person. And for a long time, she kept that promise in a technical sense. She wasn't stumbling drunk in the middle of the day. She wasn't losing weeks at a time. But she was drinking, regularly, and in ways that were slowly eroding her memory, her relationships, and her sense of self. She paced herself carefully, never drinking more than whoever she was with, ensuring no one could see the extent of it. She was also dealing with type 1 diabetes, a diagnosis she received in her early 30s, around the time the show began, which complicated the effects of alcohol on her body enormously. Moore eventually entered the Betty Ford Center for treatment. In interviews later in life, she spoke openly about her alcoholism and the way it had run through her family for generations. She lived with its consequences, alongside the complications of her diabetes, until her death in January 2017 at the age of 80. She remained one of the most admired figures in television history until the end. But the public warmth of Mary Richards barely hinted at the private battles Mary Tyler Moore carried for most of her adult life. It's worth pausing on the generational weight of that. Moore grew up watching her mother lose and regain control repeatedly. She shaped her own relationship with alcohol in direct reaction to what she'd witnessed, pacing herself, staying functional, never letting anyone see the full extent of it, and yet the outcome was strikingly similar. The disease had a way of threading through families regardless of how clearly the risks had been understood. Moore's willingness to eventually name it and talk about it openly was a significant act of honesty from someone who had every incentive to keep the image intact.
I guess it all just caught up with me. I couldn't face it. I was too frightened.
No.
Number 6. Lani O'Grady, 8 is Enough, 1977 to 1981. 8 is Enough premiered on ABC in 1977 and ran for 5 seasons. It followed the Bradford family, a father, his 8 children, and eventually a new wife, through the everyday comedy and drama of a large, busy household. It was wholesome, warm, and enormously popular. Lani O'Grady played Mary Bradford, the eldest daughter, composed, thoughtful, the one the younger kids could lean on. She was every bit as warm on camera as her character seemed. Off camera, she was falling apart. O'Grady had been dealing with panic attacks since she was 18 years old, long before she ever landed the role of Mary. 32 doctors across the years had mostly prescribed tranquilizers, Valium, Librium, Xanax, without ever landing on an accurate diagnosis. The medications numbed the anxiety, but created their own dependency. By the time she was filming 8 is Enough, the attacks were severe enough that she sometimes couldn't leave her dressing room. Set doctors would give her medication to get through the shoot. The pattern of using substances to manage unbearable internal states was already deeply embedded. By the time the series ended in 1981, O'Grady had been through 5 rehabilitation programs. She retired from acting, became a talent agent like her mother, and tried to rebuild her life on quieter ground. But the addiction had taken a physical toll that was difficult to reverse. In the early 1990s, she developed agoraphobia so severe that she couldn't leave her home for extended periods. She experienced memory blackouts. Her body, she said later, had become so toxic from years of prescription drug and alcohol abuse that entire stretches of her life simply didn't exist in her memory. In 1994, a new non-narcotic medication gave her some relief, and she spoke hopefully about her future. Then in December 1998, she returned to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center for another round of detoxification. On September 25, 2001, Lani O'Grady was found dead in her mobile home in Valencia, California. She was 46 years old, 1 week away from her 47th birthday. The toxicology report revealed fatal levels of Vicodin and Prozac in her bloodstream. The coroner could not determine whether it was accidental or intentional.
Where'd you get them? I won them in a contest.
What contest?
I forget.
Nicholas.
Number 5. Adam Rich, 8 is Enough, 1977 to 1981. If Lani O'Grady was the composed older sibling of the Bradford family, Adam Rich was its beating heart. As 8-year-old Nicholas Bradford, the youngest of the 8 children, Rich became one of the most recognized child actors of the late 1970s. He was everywhere, on lunchboxes and teen magazines, on every primetime ratings chart. His shaggy haircut became a look that thousands of kids across America tried to copy. The transition from that kind of fame to ordinary life is one that almost no child is equipped for. Rich wasn't an exception. After 8 is Enough went off the air, Rich cycled through substance abuse with a kind of terrible momentum. He struggled to find adult roles, and the contrast between who he had been at the height of his fame and the reality of post-child star life pushed him toward alcohol and drugs as a way of managing the gap. He nearly died from a Valium overdose in 1989. In 1990, he was arrested in West Hollywood for drunk driving. In 1991, he was arrested again after smashing the window of a pharmacy in the San Fernando Valley in an attempt to steal drugs. He was candid about why addiction, a disease he called his own, one he took responsibility for even as it continued to define his adult years. Dick Van Patten, who played his television father, remained one of the few people in his life who consistently showed up for him. Even after the professional ties had long since frayed, Van Patten bailed Rich out of jail during one of his arrests, an act of loyalty that went beyond the demands of any contractual relationship. Rich spent years in and out of treatment. He was eventually able to find periods of stability. He died on January 7, 2023, at the age of 54. The cause of death was an accidental fentanyl overdose, a grim reminder that the battle he had been fighting since the end of 8 is Enough never fully released its grip.
I've only got about 15 minutes before I have to go back to work. What can I do for you?
Number 4. Willie Aames, 8 is Enough, 1977 to 1981. 3 cast members of 8 is Enough. Battling addiction would already be a tragedy. Willie Aames was the 4th. Aames played Tommy Bradford on the show, the athletic, popular son, 4 kids down from the top of the Bradford lineup. He was handsome and likable on screen, and like his co-stars, he stepped directly from the protected world of the production into a Hollywood landscape that had very little infrastructure for young people trying to figure out who they were without the scaffolding of a hit show. By his own account, Aames spent most of the 1980s and into the 1990s in the grip of alcohol and drug addiction. He made some further television appearances, most notably as Buddy Lembeck on Charles in Charge from 1984 to 1990. But his personal life was in serious disarray throughout. He lost most of his earnings. His first marriage ended. He described hitting a moment of total collapse that, in his telling, eventually led him toward Christian faith as a lifeline. Aames became an outspoken advocate for sobriety and faith-based recovery in later years, and he has spoken at length about the specific pressures of being a young television star during the era of 8 is Enough, a period where no one was asking how the kids were doing, where the money flowed without the emotional tools to manage it, and where the descent from fame to anonymity could happen with terrifying speed. In a tribute after Dick Van Patten's death in 2015, Aames called his television father the most sincere person he had ever worked with, and recalled how Van Patten used to tell the cast to look around and remember what they had, because those were the good old days. He was right. Many of those days were gone before the cast had any idea they were even happening. It says something about the environment of that era that 4 of the 8 child and young adult actors on one family sitcom ended up struggling seriously with addiction. The show presented the warmest possible version of domestic life every week, and behind that warmth, real lives were fraying in ways no one in the production was equipped or perhaps inclined to address. The industry of the 1970s did not have mechanisms for protecting young people from the costs of fame, and 8 is Enough was one of the places where that gap showed most clearly.
Oh, they're here! Oh, look at them, Daddy. Just look at them. Aren't they gorgeous? Real.
Number 3, Dana Plato, Different Strokes, 1978 to 1984. Different Strokes premiered in 1978 on NBC and quickly became one of the most watched shows on American television. It starred Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges as Arnold and Willis Jackson, 2 brothers from Harlem, taken in by a wealthy Manhattan businessman, played by Conrad Bain. Dana Plato played Kimberly Drummond, the businessman's daughter, and she appeared in the show throughout most of its run. At the time of the show, Plato was a teenager navigating fame with no particular safety net underneath her. Her personal life was complicated. She became pregnant at 18 and was effectively written out of the show as a result, which at the time was handled with considerably less grace than it would be today. The industry's casual cruelty toward young women in those situations was a constant backdrop to her years on the show. After Different Strokes ended, Plato struggled to find work. Her name was famous, but her career trajectory was heading the wrong direction, and substance abuse, alcohol, and prescription drugs became the defining feature of her adult life. In 1991, she was arrested for robbing a Las Vegas video store with a pellet gun, a moment so improbable and sad that it became shorthand in popular culture for the particular kind of bottom a former child star could reach. She remarried, got engaged again, tried repeatedly to stabilize. In 1999, she appeared on The Howard Stern Show and spoke about her sobriety. The following day, she was found dead in her RV, parked outside her fiancé's family's home in Moore, Oklahoma. She was 34 years old. The medical examiner's office ruled her death a suicide by overdose of painkillers and anti-anxiety medications. Dana Plato was a young woman who never had an adequate support system around her at any point in her life. The industry took what it needed from her and left the rest largely unattended. She had landed the role of Kimberly at 13 years old. By the time she turned 18 and became pregnant, the show's producers effectively sidelined her, reducing her role sharply and eventually not renewing her contract. Her later years were spent in Las Vegas, working jobs that had no connection to the life she had known. She tried to stay visible, game shows, low-budget films, small television appearances, but the momentum never returned. What remained was a deep attachment to substances she used to manage the chronic anxiety and pain of a life that had taken her very high and left her in a place she had no map for.
Tonight, I'll never see my kids.
How come?
They don't allow kids.
Number 2. Fred Berry. What's Happening? 1976 to 1979. What's Happening was a show that crackled with energy. It followed 3 black teenagers growing up in Los Angeles, Raj, Dwayne, and the inimitable Rerun, and it balanced humor with genuine heart. Fred Berry played Rerun, the big man with the red beret, the suspenders, the shuffling dance moves, and the kind of physical comedy that made him impossible to look away from. He was a fan favorite from the moment the show began. Before What's Happening, Berry had been a member of the Lockers, a pioneering Los Angeles street dance troupe that helped shape the aesthetic of early hip-hop culture. He appeared on Soul Train and even on an early episode of Saturday Night Live. He was genuinely talented, genuinely funny, and genuinely beloved. He was also, by his own account, deeply in trouble by the time the show ended. Berry told People magazine in 1996 that he had become a millionaire by the age of 29 and then lost it all. The fat jokes ground him down. The stress of the business wore at him, and he got into drugs and alcohol in ways that consumed everything. The money, the work, the years. He was arrested for cocaine possession. He attempted suicide 3 times. After entering a substance abuse treatment program, he spent years in financial struggle, making appearances at shopping malls and charging fans for phone calls just to stay afloat. In the 1990s, Berry found religion. He lost over 100 pounds after a diabetes diagnosis. He became a Baptist minister and motivational speaker. He found a version of peace in the last decade of his life. Fred Berry died on October 21, 2003, in his Los Angeles home. He had recently suffered a stroke and was still recovering. He was 52 years old. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, but the years of damage his body had absorbed were impossible to separate from the end. What lingers about Berry's story is the distance between who he was as a performer and what his life outside of work actually looked like. On camera, he was pure joy. That enormous grin, the red beret tilted just so, the way he could get a laugh without saying a single word. The audience got all of that. What they didn't get was the version of him that was quietly drowning between takes, between seasons, between the years when the phone stopped ringing the way it used to.
That's all I have. Just a quarter of a cigarette. What is that? 2 good puffs. No, not one. That's 1 puff. That's all. 1 puff and I'll be able to sleep.
Number 1. Dick Van Dyke. The New Dick Van Dyke Show, 1971 to 1974. Dick Van Dyke is in a different category from almost everyone else on this list. He is alive, in remarkable health, and at 100 years old, still performing, still talking, still laughing with the kind of energy that seems to belong to a much younger man. But his story belongs here because it is an honest one, and because it illustrates something important about how quietly this kind of struggle can run beneath even the most successful, most loved, most apparently together people. After the beloved The Dick Van Dyke Show ended in 1966, Van Dyke moved to a new series, The New Dick Van Dyke Show, which ran from 1971 to 1974. It was during this period, and the years surrounding it, that his drinking had become a real problem. He publicly checked into a hospital in 1972 to address it, which at the time was a remarkable act of transparency for a public figure. Van Dyke has described his drinking as a social lubricant that got away from him. He was shy with strangers, genuinely, quietly introverted beneath his extrovert's gift for comedy, and alcohol helped him lower those barriers. The more it helped, the more he leaned on it. By the time he recognized it as a problem, it had already taken a meaningful piece of his life. He got help. He stayed sober. He has spoken about his alcoholism with remarkable openness over the decades since, saying repeatedly that he heard from people who said that his willingness to speak publicly about it helped them find the courage to ask for help themselves. He considers that one of the things he is most proud of. Not everyone on this list had the resources, the timing, the support, or the luck to get to where Dick Van Dyke got. He is the reminder that recovery is possible, and also the contrast that makes the other 9 stories on this list feel that much more painful. The 1970s were a golden age of American television, full of shows that gave people somewhere to go at the end of a long week. But behind a lot of the warmth and the laughter, lives were unraveling in ways that weren't visible from the outside. Some of these people found their way back. Some didn't. All of them were real human beings who carried more than their characters ever did. The shows they appeared on are still out there, in syndication, on streaming, in the memories of everyone who grew up watching them. That's worth something. But so is knowing the full story of the people who made those shows what they were. The bottle took something real from all of them, and from some of them, it took everything. If this video brought back memories of watching these shows growing up, or if it gave you a window into a world you didn't know existed behind those familiar faces, take a second to like and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from, and your support keeps this channel going.